before the next speaker, one is thank you, Coach Kathy, for organizing this event. Institute for Education, they do a lot of great events, and this is my most favorite ones because the setup, it's not like a regular discussion or seminar. Everyone's relaxed. It's a salon setup, and it's very easy to digest and to network. So thank you very much, Kathy. And anytime you wish to do any events at the embassy, my home is your home. So let's give a big hand for Kathy. And secondly, how much I appreciate the presence of Senator Mark Warner. I want to say this is a bit personal for me, Senator, because the state which you represent has its history with my family. In 1954, my father came from the poorest part of the poorest island in Indonesia, traveled 2 oceans, and went to school in University of Virginia. He was the first Indonesian to get a PhD in the United States. And he, back then, for somebody from that part of the world, from that very poor village where they didn't have anything, no electricity, no universities, nothing, to actually go to school in University of Virginia was like going to the moon today. And the sweet story that he keeps telling me was how he finished his master's degree and wanted to go to a PhD, but he had no funds, and a good Virginia family took care of him and took care of everything until he became, he graduated and became ambassador. So thank you very much from the bottom of our hearts for the kindness of the people of Virginia which you represent. And I'm glad to see more and more Indonesian companies now are actually going there, and they say that Virginia is a very good place to work with and to do business. And because of that, we would like to give you a memento from Indonesia as a sign of our friendship. This memento is actually Indonesian contribution to the American culture. You have the gong show, right? So what I want to show you is this.
I will take this, Mr. Ambassador, to the Senate. Certain senators talk too long.
Gosh, it's heavy too. I hope you're not taking the next show. Well, welcome, sport fans. Welcome to our inaugural 2013 forum, our kickoff IFE Info Public Policy Salon. Wherever IFE is, civility and collaboration prevail. Senator Mark Warner, thank you for joining us this evening. We value your commitment to our mission of promoting civility, finding common ground, and youth global citizenship. The first time you spoke at Info, it was in 2002 when you were the governor of Virginia. And as many of you will remember, at that time, IFE facilitated the 2002 Regional Leaders Summit. The first time in 26 years that the governors of Virginia and Maryland and the mayor of the district convened. You all collaborated on tourism, transportation, and technology for our capital region. And it was you, Senator, along with Mayor Williams, who is here this evening, and Republican Governor Bob Ehrlich, who is here, whose spirit of dialogue and cooperation to improve the region made that event a success. And the Regional Leaders Summit continues today quarterly. That summit inspired us all at the Institute for Education to continue playing this convening role across the aisle, locally, nationally, and in the world community. In our numerous programs abroad, from China to Egypt to our hopeful program in Kazakhstan, IFE plays a sustaining role in the constructive dialogue that you, Senator Warner, have led. And joining us this evening, you've joined a very distinguished group of past IFE Info speakers, Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize recipients, cabinet secretaries, senators, a Miss America, a professional athlete, and 5 Supreme Court justices at the Supreme Court. The Info program is IFE's flagship, 21 years strong, and over 250 speakers. INFO is a mainstay in the Washington public policy arena and a Washington institution. And we're so lucky tonight to be hosted by another Washington institution, His Excellency Dino Patti. Dino is also a best-selling author with 2 million copies of his latest book sold. And in the diplomatic world, Dino is on the cutting edge with close to 130,000 Twitter followers. Now that is something. Welcome to IFE's amazing diplomatic steward, His Excellency Jan Meintesen of the Kingdom of Belgium, and to all our extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassadors with us this evening. Of course, I want to thank IFE's leadership, Marcy Robinson, Chairman of our Board of Stewards, and 2 INFO members who participated in the 2002 Regional Leaders Summit, Chris Kane with Mercator 21, and George Vradenburg over there, founder of Us Against Alzheimer's. George, I'll be turning the floor over to you in a moment. I want to thank Greg Farmer with Qualcomm for your support, Jerry Jazanowski, Steve Taylor with United Way. Where's Steve? Steve, thank you. John Farmer with John Farmer, right over there, and Tom Patton with Phillips. Where's Tom? Thank you, Tom. And David Fenstermaker with Raymond James. Where's David? There's David. Okay, great. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, we always do a little bit of buzz as we get going. Mayor Williams, who was one of the people who founded the Regional Leaders Summit, he also holds the INFO record for speaking 8 times. Would you just say a few words about the Regional Leaders Summit for us? Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Coach, and thank you, everybody. Well, first of all, I'm proud to hold the record for speaking the most. I did it without any steroids or any drugs. Now, just a couple observations. One observation, ladies and gentlemen, you know, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, you always heard me say this, you should always hear about it if it's your capital, regardless of where you live. There's an international city, a federal city, a local city. The federal city is not functioning very well. But I got to tell you from the bottom of my heart, it was a joy to work with then Governor Warner. And if Governor Warner and his kind of way of thinking was more prevalent up there, if he had been successful with the gang of 6, or he'd always mix it up. Whatever the gang was. I'll give him a big hand because he does God's work.
Yeah! Woo!
Governor Magazine Award as Public Official of the Year for what he was able to successfully do as governor, working with the Republican legislature to write the Virginia budget bill. And so I just wish we could prevail more up there. The Leaders Summit is really part and parcel of what IFE does, which is to go, find goals that are stretch, they matter, they're a stretch, and that only IFE can pull together the people and the resources to make things happen. I like to think that the Leaders Summit is the kind of thing that IFE does well. It's a real asset to our city, a real asset to the region. And Coach, if I had a hat, I'd tip it to you. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for your leadership in the Institute for Education. Now, you all have a program, and if you don't have a program, where are the interns? Interns, come on out and make sure everybody has a program, a beautiful program, thanks to Zaina's print. Take a look at it. You'll see we have our annual Alibi Lunch coming up on January 29th at the very quirky and very elite Alibi Club, hosted by our great IFE steward, Judge William Webster. And I wouldn't be doing my job as coach if I didn't mention that at the end of the evening, we'll be giving Coach Kemper's Fall Tennis Awards after the question and answer with the senator. But I would like to make sure all the interns are in here right now, and the fellows and everybody, because we have a big award to give out. Quentin, get them all in here, please. So we haven't saved all the honors for last. Tonight it's my privilege, my honor, to recognize this year's winner of the Institute for Education Global Compass Leadership Award to an amazing young woman, IFE intern Jenny Shore. Jenny's standing right over there. Now, I've known Jenny for about 6 years, since she was 12 years old. Her first forum at 12 years old. was an info with Senator John McCain. Jenny's keen and alert observations were apparent, and I knew IFE had found a baby rock star intern. Over the last 6 years, I've watched this kid mature into a game changer, a risk taker, an initiator. One thinks that outside the box. She loves to be coached, and she coaches me in all things of her generation. She is a cherished gift. Jenny is the founder of Next Gen, a spin-off of Info for young leaders. And tonight we have the first Next Gen speaker, Dan Frumkin, formerly with the Huffington Post, and now with Neiman's Report. Dan was our very first speaker. So it's my honor to ask Senator Warner to present Jenny Shore with the Institute for Education Global Compass Leadership Award. Now let's give Jenny a big round of applause. Jenny, come on out.
I may not have every policy down, but I know how to do a great photo op.
Thank you. No, Mr. Bassett, can we get a picture of all four of us? Then you get in the middle, okay? Okay, and now it's my honor to turn the floor over to George Vradenburg, IFE's guardian angel, the founder of Us Against Alzheimer's, to introduce Senator Warner. And remember, we are all on the record right now, so you're all invited to tweet, handle at Institute for EDU, and hashtag IFE Info. Thank you.
I want to express my thanks to Kathy. She has for 21 years been the source of a rather unique kind of series of meetings in a number of different contexts, which brings together people from across the international, the federal, the local, Washington, D.C., to talk about issues of interest in a context in which civility, cooperation, and common problem-solving attitude takes hold. So Kathy has been a leader in this field and has created a somewhat unique institution in this IFE, and I've been proud to be an investor in it with my wife, Trish, who's over there. You know, Kathy speaks of the value of buzz, and I'm chairman of the Phillips Collection, and one of my former board members over there challenged me to create buzz around the Phillips. It took me 10 years. I've been chairman for 10 years. The Washington Post just recently finally talked about the buzz at the Phillips Collection. And what was it? The fact that we had created a room, very small room, but a room that Wolfgang Leib of Germany is going to create solidly a beeswax. And you walk into it, and it's an experience of smell and experience that's quite unique, much like the Rothko room. But beeswax in a room finally created buzz at the Phillips. So it takes a lot of innovation to create buzz. I want to talk just a bit about Senator Warner. I've known him as Executive Warner. I've known him as Governor Warner. I've known him as Senator Warner. And he has somewhat a unique background. You can read about it in your materials. But he has a unique experience to bring a variety of skill sets to the United States Senate, and he's doing so. By being one of the co-founders of Nextel, he certainly tried to figure out how it is that you could solve an old problem in completely different ways, how to communicate more effectively and more conveniently with a variety of mobile devices. That was an innovation that when I was growing up didn't exist, and even in the 80s was thought to be almost a brick-like structure for where the total demand for cell phones of this size and this quality and this inconvenience was probably, I remember, AT&T was estimating about 100,000 worldwide ultimate market. And it's his innovation, that capacity to innovate, to look at an old problem in new ways, which brought just a spirit of innovation, and obviously he learned a lot about finance in that role. Then he went on to governor, and he became sort of a broad-based problem solver across the public sector. as the mayor indicated, the mayor's walked out, but the fiscal problems that confronting Virginia at the time were pretty significant. And the ability to work across party lines was pretty, at the time, almost impossible. So he brought a sense of newness, problem solving, capacity in the civic collaborative spirit to bring a new way to approach government as an executive. Now he's moved on to the Senate, and of course now he's become a gang leader. The gang of 6, the gang of 8, the gang of 42, but he's become a gang leader. So he's probably, and he's taken on some difficult challenges in new ways. He's obviously been a champion of trying to work through the extraordinary fiscal imbalance and debt crisis that the country is confronting and will confront increasingly in the future. He is speaking out on guns in a way which in Virginia is not easy. And he's speaking out with a moderate voice to try and solve the issues of how it is that we can have so many of our kids being shot with automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines by guns getting into the hands of those that shouldn't have. And so he's brought a new spirit there. And close to my heart is the founder of Us Against Alzheimer, is an organization committed to stopping this disease by 2020 through rapid innovations in the way that we deal with the biomedical marketplace. He is co-chair of the Alzheimer's Caucus in the Senate. So he is bringing a new spirit, a new perspective, a new way of looking at government, and I think has already, but increasingly will, be leading from the center in the United States Senate, which is not an easy task, but in fact I think he has begun to mobilize the reputation and the history and the experience that in fact can bring the Senate to some problem-solving approaches to the tremendous problems confronting this country. So it is a great deal of pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague in a number of different contexts, Senator Mark Warner.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for having me here in your home and in this wonderful, wonderful setting. And what a remarkably useful device. It will go right into my office, and it will also be a signal when the meeting is over. Maybe I can let me Tony left and Bob Ehrlich left. But Kathy, you mentioned the fact of your leadership, and I think it really was your leadership to bring us together. It was remarkable that here we are in the nation's capital, and it had been for a variety of reasons that some obscure, some political, some just personality driven, that even though we've got this river that seems to divide the 3 jurisdictions in ways that are impossible for outsiders to fully understand, your leadership in bringing us together recognize that increasingly markets aren't going to be defined by state boundaries or county boundaries or even national boundaries. They are really centers of interest and major metropolitan areas, and we truly are enormously linked. And so I want to again thank you, Kathy, for that and so many other things that you and IFE has done over the years. I want to also commend Jenny. I was reading about her background, and it made me feel 2 things. One, a terrible underachiever. All of the things that she's done in an intern for 6 years, and soon to go off to Harvard, I understand, and starting this organization, Next Gen. And also one that maybe I've got 3 daughters, you could come and talk to them as well to kind of install in them some of that confidence and that can-do attitude. I'm grateful to be the kickoff speaker for 2013. I get a little concerned with these nice comments that the mayor made and Kathy made and George made. You would think with all those nice comments I could then come before you, Mr. Ambassador, and say, and I'm happy to report that we have fixed America's debt and deficit issues. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And I believe, as someone who has been immersed in this issue to the point perhaps of obsession, that if we feel that America is going to take on all the other appropriate, at least domestic issues that we have to confront, challenging costs of health care, questions about immigration policy, recognizing how we get our energy policy right, we're not going to get to any of those issues until we grapple with these issues around budget, debt, and deficit. Until our nation gets its balance sheet right, we're not going to take on the host of other issues that we have to confront if we are going to continue to play the critically important role that we play in the world. And if we step back from one, I want to take my time on this subject, but then in the question and answers, even with it on the record, I'll be happy to take it on any subject you'd like. But you know, if we step back for a moment and look at the size of our problem, which on one level it's $16.5 trillion in debt, a debt number that goes up by close to $3 billion every 24 hours. Even by Washington standards, $3 billion a day is a lot of money. We seem to be at one level overwhelmed by it. On the other hand, because we're blessed to live in the world's strongest economy, the currency of last resort, still with all our challenges, an enormously vibrant free enterprise system, if you look at what we have to do in terms of getting this problem under wraps on a 10-year basis, like roughly $4 to $4.5 trillion of deficit reduction, it is so much smaller than what is being asked of us in America in terms of some level of balanced way is so much smaller on a relative basis than what's being asked of the people all across Europe, not just the people in Greece or Spain, but the folks in the UK, the folks to a degree in Belgium and France, or emerging nations like Azerbaijan and Indonesia, where this world fiscal crisis is not just American-based, but it is truly world-based. And the idea that we can't seem to summon the political will to knock $4.5 trillion over a 10-year basis off of that debt is almost un-American. Now, one of the things that I've found, and I want to also compliment Norm Ornstein, who's a dear friend who's done a lot of writing on this matter and writing on the issue around collaboration and collegiality in the Congress. And because those of us who are trying to do that get some kudos and appreciate those. But he is doing the same from the journalism field, and the amount of controversy, just kind of writing how we got here from a political standpoint, he also, in my mind, fits into that kind of IFE model of how you bring people together, tell the truth, and try to find that common ground. But one of the things I've found as I've gotten into this issue, a lot of people, even a lot of my colleagues, don't understand how America came to this position and how this issue, where as recently as 12 years ago, we were looking at surpluses as far as the eye can see, how we got into this position now where this issue, in effect, trumps everything else. And I thought I'd take my couple of moments just to give a little bit, at least my view of kind of how we got here, and hopefully how we will get ourselves out, and then open the floor for questions. It is important to realize that if you look at our nation's debt, this is not a Republican or Democratic problem. Both parties have unclean hands. Matter of fact, if you go back over the last 75 plus years, America has basically on an annual basis run a deficit all but 5 or 6 of those years. So the notion that this was one party or that, both parties have plenty of blame in terms of how we got here. The question then becomes, well, we've always been running a deficit and it's gotten so much bigger now to this debt number that is so potentially overwhelming. How did it get so much worse over the last 12 years? How did it go from surpluses as far as the eye can see to the question of debt trumping virtually every other issue on the political stage? And if you think about it, going to George's comments about my background as a business guy, if you think about it from a business standpoint, it's a relatively easy proposition to show what we've done on both the revenue side and the spending side to create this enormous problem. And let me say as I go through this, and I apologize that I'm going to use some numbers, but at the end, this is about trying to make the math work. The scorekeeper in all things Washington, all things budget related, is the Congressional Budget Office. They're the referee. And the way they look at everything, from whether it's cutting revenues or increasing taxes or increasing spending or cutting spending, is all in a 10-year window. So what any action effect it will have over 10 years. So with that as a preface, let me just again point out, how do we get from surpluses to such remarkable deficits and such a debt now that potentially trumps everything? Well, here's what we did. Business 101. We dramatically cut revenues. We cut taxes, $4.5 trillion over a 10-year period. Now, if we had not simultaneously done 5 things on the spending side that were dramatically upped our spending, we could have actually gotten away potentially with that much of a revenue decrease. But here's what we did simultaneous with cutting taxes by $4.5 trillion. We did the following 5 things on the spending side. Again, both parties were part of most of these decisions, and most of them, and many of these decisions were actually done for good reasons. But let's go through those five spending choices we made. First, in the aftermath of 9/11, we doubled defense spending on a year-to-year basis. Again, some of that was necessary. Some of that, though, is perhaps not sustainable on an ongoing basis. Second, and again, this was partially necessary in the aftermath of 9/11, we created a whole new category of government spending called Homeland Security. It's expensive to take your shoes off in the airport. Third is that, and this was unprecedented, at least in modern American history, is our nation went to war not once but twice entirely on the credit card. I came of age in the 60s and the early 70s, and I was not all that keen on Richard Nixon as president, but I got to give President Nixon credit. When he took our nation to war in Vietnam, he put an income tax surcharge in place to pay for part of that war. This efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm not debating the merits of the wars, but from a purely financial standpoint, unprecedented in American history, where we went to war not once but twice without any method to pay. Fourth, we now talk about our challenges around entitlements, but we, over the last 12 years, have actually created a whole new entitlement. Early 2004, 2005 timeframe, we saw that our parents and grandparents were struggling with the rising costs of pharmaceutical drugs, so we created a whole new part of Medicare, the so-called Medicare Part D. On one level, it has been less costly and more successful than we anticipated. Yet, at the same time, it still has added more than $1 trillion of cost, not a dime paid for. And then we've got the final issue. And this one is, especially in a room with the press, so I have to say this in a politically correct way, and it is actually a blessing, but we're all living a lot longer. This is an erudite, well-informed, intelligent group. I'm going to give you my first quiz question. Who was the person who set 65 originally as the retirement age? No, George, you're wrong. He gives a classically American-centric answer. He suggested President Roosevelt. It was not. The first person who set 65 as the retirement age was Bismarck when he was premier of Germany in the 1870s. And why did he set 65 as the retirement age? They actually would give you a government check, was because your average life expectancy at that point was high 50s. A perfect politician promise. We'll give you a check if you outlive the actuarial tables. Even when Roosevelt started Social Security in 1934, life expectancy was 62. Now, and this is not something as a problem, this is something as a blessing, in America today, we live to an average age of 80, and if you're a healthy woman at age 20, as Jenny is, your life expectancy is 100. That is not a bad thing, that is a blessing, but it also means that Social Security and Medicare are some of the most successful social programs, not just in America, but in modern history. The basic underlying math just isn't working. So, for example, when I was a kid, there were 16 people working for every one person on Social Security. Today, there are 3. By 2030, it'll be down to 2. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to protect and preserve the promise of Social Security, but it does mean that the math around these programs need to change. So, where are we now? We now have seen Congress fail 4 different times. Spring of 11, the debacle around the debt ceiling in August of 2011, the failure of the so-called super committee that wasn't very super. And then most recently, while we avoided the worst consequences of the fiscal cliff, we did nothing really with the deal that was dealt with at the end of the year in terms of taking on this problem in a meaningful way. Will we summon the political will to find a way out of it? I absolutely believe that there are the votes in the Senate and that there is the will amongst the American people. The challenge is going to be that it's going to require us to kind of take off our red team, blue team mindset and realize that that it is going to require more revenues than it was even obtained at the end of the year. It's going to require additional spending cuts, but spending cuts that actually have some sense and rationality to them, as opposed to the so-called sequester. I was with the Secretary of the Navy the other day. The sequester cuts, Mr. Ambassador, is every area of our defense budget is cut, regardless of whether it performs or not, by about 8 to 9% if the so-called sequester goes through. The Secretary of the Navy pointed out appropriately, you can't build 92% of a ship. So a whole series of actions will take place with the sequester cuts, which will actually cost us more money than we'll save by breaking some of the contracts. And it is going to require trying to take on the entitlement programs in a way, as a Democrat and a progressive, believe that maintains their promise. George made mention, and Tony made mention of the fact of, how are the gangs? Again, only in Washington, if you actually try to work together across party lines, when you put a substantive proposal together, are you then called a gang member? I don't completely understand how that phenomena started. But I think, my hope is that there will be success. I was disappointed that there was not more interest in us coming forward with a bipartisan plan after the election. It wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have perhaps allowed the President and the Speaker to kind of narrow the playing field, as opposed to starting in their corners and kind of running out the clock until the 11th and a half hour. We're going to now see, if not, we're not careful, a repeat of that. What gives me hope that we will avoid it? 3 or 4 items, and then I'll take questions. One is the overwhelming majority, I think, of members of Congress, at least in the Senate, I can't speak to the House, but know that something has to be done. They understand why the Congress's approval rating is right there next to the Kardashian family, and actually lower than the Communist Party at this point in terms of, they get it. Second, the fact is that I think the American public gets it. But what we've not done is made, as opposed to kind of making this an us versus them, red versus blue issue, really make this kind of a call to arms, because this is, and I say this with all appropriate respect to the challenges our troops face and the challenges now of Americans being kidnapped in Algeria, but this debt and deficit is a greater threat to our national security than any single terrorist group out there. Not my words, but former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen's words. And I do believe there is a recognition amongst the American people that if we kind of do this country first, and I've got some specific ideas on how we do that, particularly on the revenue side, I think we'll get there. And finally, when I get into really the hard points, when people say, well, are you ever going to get together? And there are a number of us in the Senate, again, Kathy, in the kind of mode that you've exemplified with IFE, trying to do things. Lamar Alexander and I host dinners on a kind of quiet basis, 20 at a time, over at the Alibi Club, 10 Ds, 10 Rs. We're going to have 4 or 5 of these, where we try to spend some time outside of your kind of team meetings, which is where most of the time our senators are in town. They're held in caucus meetings as opposed to time actually getting to know each other. We try to break some of that mold. So there is a growing recognition amongst many of us that we've got to get there. And when I run out of other reasons why I know that we will get it done, I always fall back on that great Churchill quote. And this room would be the one that would know it. Most rooms I kind of, they don't recall it, but for the interns maybe who have not heard it. Winston Churchill, early on during the challenges around World War II, was quoted to say, he said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." Well, we at this moment in our political evolution, this moment in terms of the questioning and role that America is going to play in our 21st century, this moment in terms of the fact that we have whiffed on this horribly 4 times, I think we will do the right thing because we have tried everything else. So with that, Kathy, my thanks for the opportunity to come, Mr. Ambassador, again. My thanks for your willingness to host us. I look forward to us visiting more. And I'm now saying, even with Eleanor Cliff jotting notes away, the floor is open. Questions are open. Thank you all very much. Questions, comments, criticisms?
David, where's David?
Oh, I'll start.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Wow.
David Hawkins with Real Talk.
Thank you very much. Senator, what's the easiest Democratic sacred cow to topple over in these talks, and what's the toughest?
Well, the easiest issue from a kind of a math standpoint to grapple with is Social Security. But the problem is, and it is true, that Social Security does not contribute to the deficit. Well, that's partially true, because of the surpluses in the Social Security Trust Fund, we've been basically borrowing money to fund the rest of the government at a lower level since we've had that pot of money in the set aside. And one of the things that I make my point to my colleagues is, the challenges around Social Security is that the lines have crossed, and we're now paying out more than we're taking in. I go back to my 16 people working, to now 3, to now then 2. Everyone will acknowledge that you've got to grapple with Social Security, and it's going to get, the hole gets deeper each week, month we wait. Many of my colleagues on the Democratic side perhaps they don't want to commingle the two around debt and deficit. I would argue starting Social Security on a separate debt reduction path with a commission with an up or down vote, because we know what the mechanisms are, would actually do more to get us to an overall solution. Would also make it less, just putting it in the mix. In effect, I would argue from just a plain politics standpoint, by saying we're going to take on all our entitlement programs would mean that you'd have to do less out of Medicare and Medicaid. And since I think the solution set is actually around raising the cap, change CPI, certain other issues, and our proposal on Social Security actually increase the amount of contribution that we would make and the amount of payment out to the lowest 20%, and actually give another bump up for people who live past 85, because people are outliving their private pensions. So it would have, I think, some tremendous low-income protections. So I think Social Security, from a pure math standpoint, is the easiest. The one that is harder is Medicare, because, quite honestly, Medicare costs go around issues about how we truly try to lower healthcare costs in the country. And while those of us who supported the Affordable Care Act believe that's a step in the right direction, we don't really know if it's going to fully work. And the numbers grow so exponentially quicker, and we can't really sort through how the reforms in Affordable Care Act are going to work. 2 points I would just make as well on Medicare. One is that because we need numbers in the range of over 10 years, about $400 billion has been kind of on the low side what some of the Medicare numbers have been. And a lot of people are saying, well, we ought to go ahead and means test Medicare. Well, I think that ought to be on the menu. The problem with the means testing always comes from wealthier groups because they assume everybody falls in that category. Means testing, for example, only gets you around $60 to $75 billion. So how you sort through this around Medicare and really drive down costs are challenging. 2 points, last points I want to make on that. One is that, and this is kind of the counter, is that we don't know. I think Affordable Care Act, in terms of pushing away from quantity, more towards quality, and more towards healthcare outcomes, is going to be very successful. The Medicare problem really is much more in the second 10 years than it is in the first 10 years. And the current way things are counted in Washington, any of the out-year changes, we don't get any credit for those right now. Even Mr. Ryan, when he put forward his proposal, he didn't do anything on Medicare till past the first 10 years. So there is a technical kind of you and me, Norm green-eyed shades problem of how you're going to really make long-term changes, how you're going to be able to do those in a thoughtful way to phase them in, recognizing you're not going to get credit in the out years. And so the secondary corollary to that is, trying to do some level of reset. If Affordable Care Act doesn't get us the changes we need, having some kind of reset 5, 7, 8 years out that would then allow different kind of enforcement mechanisms would be part of the debate that's really not being discussed at this point. Sorry about techie answer there. Chris?
So if the president wants to cut by $800 billion, is that right?
Say again?
By $800 billion, he's trying to cut expenses.
Well, what he did was the sequester had $1.2 trillion. Half of it defense, half of it non-defense.
So if Alzheimer's costs $200 billion a year, which it does. I know this is not really a prophylactic nation, but how would you go about convincing the Senate that this is really necessary rather than sequester, which will cut 7%
Well, I think,
from it?
Tricia, you know, obviously I'm a believer. Tricia's family struggled with this. My family has struggled with this. This is a disease that takes an enormous emotional toll on every family. It's almost more the caregivers in the family even than sometimes the patient, and has costs that if you graph it out with an aging of this population, just explode. And it partially begs the question. Let me answer your question in two ways. It was what made me so against Mr. Ryan's budget. And I say that not because I disagreed with some of the things Mr. Ryan would do on Medicare and Medicaid, but the real challenge I had with Mr. Ryan's budget was the current federal government only spends 16 cents of every tax dollar we pay on what we call domestic discretionary. What that means in English is all that the federal government spends on education, roads, bridges, infrastructure, research and development, which goes to the heart of Alzheimer's, early childhood, energy, law enforcement, all of those things. Mr. Ryan's budget would have taken that 16 cents and taken it to less than 5 cents on every tax dollar over a 20-year period. Not only would that mean we would cut off areas like research and development, but what I got upset with was that's just a bad business model. In a global world, as somebody that spent a career investing in startup businesses, the three things you looked at, regardless of business, if you're a smart investor, you look at what's the workforce like and how are you going to continue to improve the quality of the workforce? What's your plant and equipment going to be? How are you going to make, whether you make widgets or furniture, how do you make sure you stay ahead of your competition with good quality equipment? And then third is, how do you stay ahead of the competition? Well, governments do the same thing. We just call it different categories. We call it education and workforce training. For plant and equipment, we call it infrastructure. And staying ahead of the competition in a global world is going to be, Belgium, Kazakhstan, Indonesia are not going to grant America economic supremacy just because we happen to be blessed to be Americans. They're going to fight for it. How do you stay ahead? Research and development. I would never invest in a business that spent less than 5 cents on every dollar on educating its workforce, building its infrastructure, and stay ahead of the competition. And that would hurt us. That's where we need to make some of these commitments. Continue to invest. You can't cut and tax your way only out of this problem. You've got to grow as well. Well, I think there is a plan, but the challenge is with the deal, for example, on the revenues was we didn't get near enough revenues. For example, lots and lots of people have said Gang of Six or Simpson Bowles. And many friends of mine in the business community, on today's baselines, Gang of Six and Simpson Bowles had $2.4 trillion of new income. The president just did a deal for $600 billion. And I've looked at this every which way you can. You can't get there with just 600, but you're going to need more cuts. You also need more revenue. And one other point I would just want to make on the revenue side, and just an idea that I'll be saying more about later, is that I've been blessed to do very well. I believe strongly in a progressive tax code. I think that those of us who've done well can and should contribute more. But we can't get that full amount of additional revenue we need just from people above 250,000 or above 400,000. One of the things that I think that could change the whole framework of this debate would be actually thinking about putting a debt reduction surcharge in place that would actually hit everybody above the poverty level at a minimum level and then ramp up. So we would change this frame of the debate from an us versus them to, we're all in it together, and the equivalent of a war bond campaign. Americans would do their part if particularly these were funds that were segregated off in a debt reduction sinking fund. There's some of this is just financial optics, just as there is no such thing as a real Social Security trust fund. But if you had that tracking device, if you had a debt reduction clock, if you said we're all going to do our part so that we can continue to invest in research and development, so we can continue to make sure that those programs that protect the most vulnerable of us don't disappear, and those of us who've done better do more, and there's a lot of details on this I'll roll out at some point. I think it could be one of the new ideas. What we need in this debate right now, on the revenue side and on the entitlement side and others, is not simply replowing the same arguments with the same people in the same room. Because we've seen this movie 4 times.
Thank you, Senator. If it's true, and I believe it is, that the budget crisis that we have in Europe and the United States are not just as part of an economic cycle, but are due to the fact that we have lived beyond our means for a very long time. If that's true, it would seem to follow that we can only fix the crisis if we collectively accept that we will have to lower our standard of living. Will you agree with that?
No, I would not agree with that. I think that the changes, let me put this in 3 buckets. The changes around social insurance in our country's Social Security are so relatively small and can be phased in over a period of time that I don't believe that Social Security, which I think is extraordinarily successful and needs to be maintained, would have to be dramatically changed. Yes, I know I for one have, for example, suggested that we ought to include in part of our changes something called chain CPI, which is a different way of calculating consumer price indexes. A modest change, but when you do the kind of bottom bump up and above 85 bump up, I actually think our approach would better protect the vulnerable. Social Security, I think, can be fixed without any decline in kind of at the macro level significant benefits. Healthcare is a challenge. You know, we've seen in Europe you're able to do it at a cheaper rate than we, but you know we are going to have to have conversations, and this is not one that is about finances, but it's about quality of life, end of life issues. We're going to continue to have conversations about how we, I think, fundamentally change the value proposition in our healthcare system from volume to quality. And again, I think there's many things we can learn from the rest of the world. For a long time, Americans have always believed that we always had the best idea in everything. We now still have great ideas in so many areas, but I think there are things we can learn from the rest of the world. And the third, in terms of overall, is I fundamentally believe that why I had such problems with Mr. Ryan's budget that so dramatically cut back education, infrastructure, and R&D. I believe so fervently in the power of kind of innovation and growth to continue to provide better and better qualities of life. And I think that, I can't predict what the next wave is going to be, but I sure as heck would bet on it and believe in it. And I go back again to these very same kind of doomsayers, more about America's economy than, say, Europe's, but America's doomsayers in the late 80s, when everybody was saying, oh, America's got huge debts, we're not doing very well in education, we're not making things anymore, our manufacturing sector's going down, and we're about to be swallowed by this emerging Asian nation that was going to eat our lunch. Of course, the nation at that point was Japan. But what happened in the 90s is we've got our balance sheet right, and at the same time we invested in innovations and things like the telecommunications revolution, the internet revolution, beginnings in biotech, led to a period that was enormously profitable. And but for kind of taking our eye off the ball on the financial bubble, I think would not have us dealing with such a enormity. What this belief is that there's kind of no brighter future going forward. Sorry about the long answer. Please.
A two-part political question. One is, so you and Senator Alexander are having your gang plenty of whatever. Is it possible to do that in concert with a similar group in the House? And the second question is what is the price to pay for this collaboration, potential collaboration? It's so great, which Senator Lugar is poster child for this, that it really, at the end of the day, is a practical matter of relationship.
One of the things I've learned as a new senator, the kind of the adages that's often made, if you're a Democrat, the Republicans are the opposition, the enemies of the House. There's and vice versa from the House to the Senate. So these kind of forums, there need to be more of them. If the mayor of the District of Columbia and the governor of Maryland and the governor of Virginia can actually meet and get along and like each other, we sure as hell should be able to get the Democrats and Republicans in the Congress to work together, because the bad blood between Virginia and Maryland was much harder than the bad blood between Democrats and Republicans. And I say this in closing, first of all to our international friends who are here. The world desperately needs a strong America. With all our problems, I wouldn't trade our position with anyone else in the rest of the world. With as perhaps inept as some of our financial reform has been, our financial system is stronger than the banking system in the United States, is stronger than the banking system anywhere else in the world. For all our challenges around education, the best and the brightest in the world still desperately want to come to America to get a chance to get an American dream or to get an education. For all of the problems, as you mentioned, Mr. Master, in terms of do we have to retard our have we gone full circle? That's just not in the American DNA to acknowledge that or admit that or accept that. And that spirit is so alive and vibrant. So for our international visitors, a strong American economy recovery to the next stage is good for everyone. And for those of us who are Americans in the room, this is too important just to leave your elected officials. Don't just add a boy, add a girl. You gotta show that you're in this fight regardless. I mean, Trish left, she cares deeply about Alzheimer's. We're not going to get to Alzheimer's until we get this fixed. We're not going to get the immigration until we get this dealt with. We cannot continue to lurch along on every 60, 90-day ways of running the largest institution in the world, the federal government of the United States. It's lunacy. So, we need your voices to be raised. We need them particularly to be raised to those members, and I give particularly those who've been career members who are willing to put country first. And again, if that doesn't convince you, just remember Churchill. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator. I mean, those are really fabulous words of a patriot, and I hope all of our young Institute for Education fellows and interns listen to that, because they are brilliant words of wisdom. And now we'll have the Tennis Awards. Mark Ein, who is the owner of the Washington Castles Tennis, and Mark, welcome. I know you had to come in a little bit late because you were flying in from New York, but tell me, the Washington Castles World Team Tennis, we're #1, right? Yes. Yes, Mark is the owner of the Washington Castles, and so, and they're #1, and I think you all should try to make it out there in July. I don't know, Mark, say a couple words about the Washington Castles. It's a totally cool World Team Tennis.
Well, all my tennis inspiration came from you, Kathy.
Yeah, you need some more lessons, Mark,
Because I saw how you brought Washington together on the tennis court when I first moved back here, and then when I had a chance to bring the World Team Tennis franchise to Washington, D.C., I saw it as a great opportunity to do something similar. And so we've been here 5 years. We play in a stadium on the waterfront. We've won the championship 3 of the last 4 years. We've had back-to-back undefeated seasons, the first 2 in the 37-year history of World Team Tennis, which was founded by Billie Jean King. And our 32-match winning streak is the second longest winning streak in the history of pro sports. In our first match next year, we go to tie the Lakers. In the second match, we go to beat them. So hopefully we'll see everyone there. But thank you, Kathy, because truly you are the one who created the notion that you can bring people together on the court, and we've just tried to follow in your footsteps.
He's a very good politician, No, this is a fun thing to do, though, if you get the opportunity in July to go down and watch the tennis. The people drink and they talk, and it's very lively. It's not, as if you're at the U.S. Open or Wimbledon and you all have to be very well behaved. This is just the opposite. It's fun. It's super fun. So now with the Tennis Awards. Okay, we have a number of awards. Why don't we start out with the best overhead. Now, if anybody's not a tennis player, an overhead is like And it's very similar to a CERB. The person who gets that award this year is Dr. Reverend Cecile Stroman of Norway. Come on up. It's because when Cecile is up at the net and the ball goes up there and she gets the overhead, boom, the point's done. You know, she's going to win that point right away. So let's see here. That's overhead. There we go. And now let's have Rosa from the Embassy of Portugal. She has the most improved backhand. Okay, Rosa has a very good forehand, but her backhand needs a little work. And now her backhand is just, you know, smart and zips across, and she's a great follow through. So Rosa, you have a backhand. There we go. There we go. Congratulations. And now let's have Ed Henry. Ed Henry has the best attitude. And the reason Ed has the best attitude is when you call up Ed and say, you know, do you want to join some doubles? He never says, well, who's playing and like what party are they from or anything like that. Ed just says, sounds great, you know, and he comes out there and he doesn't say if they're good or they're bad. He just gets out there and performs. And so you have the best attitude.
I just want to have a rebuttal because I appreciate the attitude, but I think I have a good forehand. And I was going to stay, but I'm in discussions with Mark Ein right now about my future. So.
Well, next year, Ed, we'll work on that forehand and see if we can get that forehand going. And let's have Christine Sager, the best footwork. Now, if you all have your program, you'll look at this and you'll see Christine. She's sitting on a tractor because she was injured playing with us at the Swedish Embassy, and she took a tractor up the hill to get off the court. And now look at, she's back, and she's back. So this is, you know, good footwork and everything. Christine, congratulations. Stay up here. And now, last but not least, our host, who is a really good tennis player. He has his own tennis court as well. Dino, you get the best serve. So come on up. I almost wanted to give you the best dressed, but I decided the best serve. There. Congratulations. So there they are. We'll get over there and get a team photo in a second. And we also, when we play, we have target practice, meaning when they hit a little target, you know, I mean, hitting targets is not easy. And so we give awards for the target hitters. So Rosa, Cecile, and Christine get the award for the most targets hit, and they get champagne. So here's your champagne. So Senator Warner, could you come up here for the photo op with us, please? Wish we could give you a tennis award. And after we get done with the photos, there's a wonderful buffet right over here to my left, and there's more beverages to help yourself with. So thank you all for coming. It was a great time. Thank you, Senator Warner. You were just terrific. Thank you, Ambassador, for hosting us all.